Hello everyone, tonight we are crawling literally through a tunnel that shouldn't exist. Your palms are scraped, knees bruised, and the air smells like dry clay and forgotten breath. The tunnel walls are strangely even, almost as if something designed them. You keep moving forward because, well, turning around in this space isn't exactly easy. And besides, curiosity is a monster with claws of its own. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Post your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. You shuffle along hunched and swearing under your breath as another root brushes your face like a spider leg. It's narrow, but not haphazard. The ceiling is rounded, the walls smooth with just enough curve to suggest intention. Maybe erosion, you think at first. Then you see the claw grooves. Parallel scratches evenly spaced carved into the left-hand wall like ancient tally marks, except these aren't from counting. These are from building. The tunnel turns, dips slightly, and widens just enough for you to sit back on your heels. That's when the silence hits you. Deep, almost syrupy silence that makes your ears hum. It's the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched even when you're alone. You take a breath. It's cool. Considerably cooler than the roasting surface you crawled in from. The temperature shift is so noticeable it makes your scalp prickle. This wasn't just a shelter, it was air conditioning, Cretaceous style. And here's where it gets weird. This tunnel wasn't made by weather or time. It was made by a dinosaur. And not just any dinosaur, one that for all its evolutionary gifts had a chronic overheating problem in the least convenient body part possible, its tail. Now, tails are a whole thing in paleontology. For balance, for defense, for display, you name it. But this tail was different. Highly vascularized, meaning packed with blood vessels. Like a radiator that couldn't be shut off. When midday sun scorched the plains, this tail would start cooking from the inside out. Not ideal for a creature whose survival depended on lying low, literally. Historians still debate whether this dinosaur, let's call it Thermovenator infracaudalis, because if you name something in Latin it immediately sounds believable, was an herbivore or something sneakier. What we do know, thanks to a string of fossilized tail impressions and a collapsed burrow system in Patagonia, is that this creature didn't survive in spite of the heat it designed around it. Picture a creature about the size of a minivan, low-slung like a Komodo dragon but with a tail like a windsurfing fin, tall, broad, and made for either slicing through water or catching every bit of sun. Bad evolutionary move. Maybe. Or maybe the tail had another purpose we still don't understand. Some researchers argue it was a mating display, like a peacock's fan. Others, they think it was a thermal regulator gone haywire, evolving faster than the dinosaur's brain could catch up. But one thing's certain, it needed a solution. You look around again. The tunnel's height is just under 4 feet, the floor is gently grooved, and the ceiling is domed. Not jagged, not random. This isn't a sinkhole. This was planned. You can almost see it, this heat-struck creature dragging its belly through dry earth, scraping forward with elbowed limbs, and pushing soil backward with each flex of its ribcage. The front claws are flattened in fossils, likely from years of excavation. This dinosaur didn't just survive, it specialized. Off to your right, the wall opens briefly into a side chamber. A small alcove just big enough for a curled body or a tail cooling in the earth like a slow-cooked stew. You shine your light across the roof. It's streaked with mineral deposits, some of them glossy. Sodium maybe, sweat residue from centuries of exposure. That's speculation, of course, but this whole thing is speculation dressed in sandstone. And here's the kicker. Some of these tunnels run for meters, not feet. Meters. They slope down, gradually, curve subtly toward groundwater channels, and in some rare cases even lead to intersecting tunnels, suggesting not one builder, but a species with blueprints. It wasn't just a cooling strategy, it was a way of life. Oddly enough, this reminds you of prairie dogs or naked mole rats. Modern animals that build elaborate tunnels not for food, but for climate, to beat the sun at its own game. Except, those animals are tiny. Thermovenator was not. It was heavy. Digging wasn't just about comfort, it was about commitment. These tunnels took days, maybe weeks to carve. Imagine digging a fallout shelter with your bare limbs every summer. Now imagine that shelter was just for your tail. And just to keep things from making too much sense, we've got one fossil. Just one where a secondary tunnel branches off into what looks like a shallow scoop, almost like a bathtub. Historians still debate whether this was a failed nest, a mud trap for cooling the tail faster, or something ceremonial. You can picture two dusty archaeologists arguing over it while a third quietly eats trail mix in the background. Modern engineers use thermal sinks and electronics to pull heat away from vital components. This dinosaur was living proof that nature figured it out first on a bigger scale and with claws instead of copper. You inch deeper into the tunnel's stomach, brushing dirt. It's not claustrophobic yet, but it will be. And as you go, the walls begin to whisper. Not real sound, of course, but old sound. The kind you only hear when it's too quiet to lie to yourself. You wipe a line of sweat from your temple, but the air down here keeps getting cooler. Not cold exactly, just less like the surface of the sun. You pause, breath held, trying to catch the difference. It's subtle. The tunnel slope is barely noticeable, yet you're definitely descending. Your fingers graze the wall again and find ridges scraped in one direction. Always one direction. Whatever dug this, it knew the way forward. Up above the world is all heat and hunger. You remember it well. The midday sun in this part of the world doesn't just shine, it presses, like a hot lid over a boiling pot. Even under cloud cover, the ground here bakes from the inside out. That's the part you don't learn from fossils, you have to feel it. The dry kind of heat that makes your shadow look tired. And yet this tunnel, it resists that. You start to realize what this place truly is. It's not a burrow, it's a siphon, a heat vacuum. One that's been quietly draining warmth from the air for millions of years. You sit back and picture it, the dinosaur backing in, dragging its grotesquely vascularized tail like a living thermometer, feeling for the sweet spot where blood could cool before circulating again. The deeper it went, the safer it became. It wasn't hiding, it was regulating. There's something elegant about it. Reptiles have always been masters of temperature after all. Crocodiles bask with mouths open. Komodo dragons dig shallow pits, but this was HVAC before thermostats. An organic response to catastrophic solar violence. And you have to wonder, did the first thermovenator just collapse into a shady ditch? One day feel better and think, wait a minute. Weirder still, some tunnels were revisited year after year. Paleontologists found claw grooves layered like growth rings, deeper cuts beneath fresher ones. As if these creatures returned to the same spot seasonally, refurbishing their cooling systems like prehistoric handymen. Historians still debate whether this behavior was instinctual or passed on through some form of learned migration, which opens an uncomfortable question. How much did they remember? Your hands move across a dry crust on the wall, salt bloom. Heat and evaporation pushing minerals outward the same way sweat dries into white maps on your shirt. This tunnel, in its prime, probably smelled like copper and wet dust. The air down here now is thinner, yes, but preserved. You're not just breathing Earth, you're breathing decisions. Evolution's discarded blueprints. And here's where things get romantic. A research paper you once skimmed described the phenomenon as biothermal consciousness. The idea being an animal that doesn't merely adapt to heat, but becomes aware of it. Seeks it out, plays with it. Like dolphins riding bow waves. Like cats finding the only sunbeam in a cold room. Maybe Thermovenator didn't just suffer heat, it chased its thresholds, lived precisely on the edge of boiling, and built its home to flirt with the line. You can't help but smirk? Imagine telling a room full of academic skeptics, yes, this dinosaur engineered passive temperature management systems using topographical microclimates. They'd laugh you into extinction. And yet, what else could this be? Now you crawl deeper, eyes adjusting to the dim rust of dirt and memory. The tunnel narrows slightly, then flares into a shallow basin. Not a nest too smooth, too deliberate. You kneel in the center stretch, a hand upward, and feel the air swirl. It's not just cooler here, it's flowing. A draft, a breeze. From where you shuffle toward the left edge and notice a chimney, a shaft leading upward at a sharp angle. It's narrow, clearly intentional. Early thermal design possibly used to vent rising heat while the tail cooled below. Primitive convection. Even today, termite mounds use similar designs to control internal climate. It turns out engineering is older than opposable thumbs. Your body starts to ache, but your brain won't stop. What if these dinosaurs weren't just surviving? What if they were performing? Imagine a midday ritual. The creatures gather at tunnel entrances, their tails raised like banners, then slowly descend backwards into their cooling dens, like monks bowing to the sun, or exhausted commuters falling into hammocks. Odd fact, there's a lizard in Australia, the thorny devil, that can drink through its skin by channeling dew along its scales to its mouth. Completely unrelated to Thermovenator, obviously, but it reminds you nature doesn't do normal. It does functional weirdness. There's something almost hopeful about it, that even in a world trying to roast you alive, you can dig deep and find a pocket of relief. A pause, a strategy. You press your back to the dirt and feel the tunnel hold you like a shallow grave but a comfortable one. You finally understand this wasn't escape. It was control. A creature dragging its weakness into the ground and sculpting that weakness into architecture. That's not just survival, that's poetry. You start to laugh. The sound bounces off the walls and dies halfway to your ears. You're not sure why you're laughing. Maybe because the image of a dinosaur burrowing through solid clay just to cool its butt is hilarious. Or maybe because it worked. Up ahead, the tunnel dips again. Steeper this time. Like it's daring you. You sigh, crack your neck, and crawl on. Your elbows are mud-colored now, your knees numb. You can't tell whether the ache in your spine is from crawling or from the weight of what you're beginning to realize. This tunnel, it wasn't built for escape or for eggs or for food. It was carved stubbornly out of sheer thermodynamic necessity because the tail, oh, that tail, refused to behave. You reach another flat segment and allow yourself to sit for a moment. Your breathing echoes slower now, syncing with the rhythm of the place. It feels like the tunnel is exhaling with you. And as the minutes slide by, one thought keeps returning, that ridiculous over-engineered tail. A tail that could overheat fatally. A tail so full of blood vessels it pulsed visibly in the fossil record. A tail that nearly betrayed its host every single day of its life. Imagine being a creature built with such a fatal flaw. A liability attached to your spine. You couldn't climb trees, you couldn't outpace predators, you certainly couldn't lie in the sun too long. Your tail would begin to cook you alive. Literally. Heat stress isn't hypothetical, it leaves bone scars. And these fossils uncovered in baked plains across ancient Patagonia show signs of stress fractures along the caudal vertebrae. Bones warped by repeated overheating. The scientific term thermal osteodystrophy. The ancient term bad design. Historians still debate whether this tail was the result of positive selection, some kind of sexual display, or simply a byproduct of failed adaptation. Some argue the tail helped in intimidation rituals. Others believe it functioned like a solar panel, absorbing heat in early mornings and storing it for cooler evenings. All fine ideas until you remember what midday felt like back then. On the worst days, the surface of the soil could reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not tail warming. That's tail baking. And yet evolution rarely apologizes. It improvises. You reach a curve in the tunnel where the walls seem scraped more desperately, as though the digger panicked. Here, the claw marks cross each other wildly. One gouge cuts deep, exposing a different color beneath darker, moist clay, cool to the touch. You pause. It's the kind of spot a dying creature might reach, or a clever one might aim for. You run your hand along the groove. The layers in the dirt aren't just geological, they're chronological. Claw marks over claw marks, a symphony of desperate design. And in your head, you imagine one of them tail thrumming with blood and heat dragging itself to this very spot, laying its tail into the trench and waiting. Just waiting. You chuckle. A dinosaur with a cooling strategy more advanced than some modern buildings. That tail wasn't just inconvenient, it was central. A whole life orbiting its needs. Every decision shaped by that one thing. Travel routes, sleep positions, territory limits, even diet. One researcher theorized that Thermovenator might have chewed bitter plants with mild anesthetic qualities, not to dull pain, but to slow its own metabolism during peak heat hours. A sedated dinosaur half-dreaming tail buried in cool soil, while its brain idled like a car in neutral. It sounds made up, but then again so does this tunnel. You move on. The air tightens slightly, which tells you you're approaching another chamber. And sure enough, it opens rounder this time. A true burrow room. You shine your light along the walls. More ridges, but also discoloration. Faint reddish stains, iron deposits, or something else. Maybe a tail injury that bled during a particularly hot descent. You'd never know. On the floor, the groove is especially deep. Not foot-shaped, not belly-worn, tail-shaped. It spirals slightly at the end. A flourish. Or maybe just the act of settling in, shifting for comfort, like a dog turning 3 times before it lays down. Behavior fossilized into dirt. You sit there and try to picture it again. A creature maybe 25 feet long, low to the ground, not fast but not clumsy. Big limbs padded for scraping, a heavy tail dragging like an anchor behind it. That tail thin-skinned, packed with vascular tunnels, maybe even flaring outward at the base like a fan. At rest, it wouldn't tuck close. It would extend backward, almost reverently, as if needing distance from the rest of the body to cool properly. That's why these tunnels weren't wider. They were long. Just long enough to slide in backward like plugging in a heatsink. You think about the anatomy. Blood vessels near the skin flowing fast. Muscle coated in fat, but only at the base. A shape designed not for movement, but for surface exposure. It's the opposite of an armadillo. Less armor, more radiator. And then you remember a fun oddity. The pangolin modern-day insectivore can direct blood flow to its tail when threatened, heating it like a weapon. The reverse of what Thermovenator needed, but proof that blood flow tail manipulation isn't science fiction. Did it hurt? That's the real question. When that tail got too hot, was it pain or just shutdown? Did they learn to associate the sting with movement? Did young ones instinctively wriggle into shallow soil when it got unbearable like human children flopping onto tile floors in the summer? You smile at the image toddler-sized dinosaurs flopping backwards into the dirt like cartoon characters' tails first. Then you remember this wasn't cute. This was survival. These tunnels weren't convenience. They were lifelines. A scraping sound behind you makes you flinch. Just dirt settling. Probably. But your heartbeat still jumps. You're too deep now for jokes. This place wasn't made for you. And the further you crawl, the more you wonder, are you following the tail or is it leading you? The walls close in again tighter now, as if the tunnel was built in a rush. You lean forward on your elbows, ignoring the grinding ache in your joints, and press on. The ground feels rougher here. More gravel, less clay. You blink sweat out of your eyes, And notice the claw marks are fresher looking or maybe just better preserved. They aren't mindless scratches, they're purposeful. Every sweep of earth, every indentation in the sidewalls forms a pattern, not just digging, engineering. Thermovenator, for all its tail-related baggage, wasn't sloppy. You stop and trace a smooth concavity along the tunnel wall, realizing it curves slightly inward, forming a shallow brace against potential collapse. These weren't brute force burrows, they were reinforced, like an amateur architect learning by doing. That doing, of course, happened over several 100,000 generations. Trial and error, with stakes, like extinction. You pull yourself forward another few feet and notice a rare feature, a vertical indentation cut sharply into the right side, almost like a step. No animal needed a stair here. It's more likely a brace point, a place to wedge a limb and push with torque. A leverage strategy. These tunnels weren't just made with claws, they were sculpted with elbows, shoulders, hips, even ribs. Fossils show microfractures along the thoracic bones of some thermovenator specimens, stress injuries. These creatures weren't just using their arms, they were throwing their entire bodies into the earth. And for what shade coolness? You reach a bend, and there embedded like a fossilized shrug is a shoulder-width cavity in the dirt. You recognize it instantly, a shove zone, where the dinosaur may have wedged itself sideways to push through a tougher sediment pocket. It's the prehistoric equivalent of grunting your fridge up the stairs, inelegant but effective. The odd part. These tunnels were never that deep. They weren't for escaping predators, nor were they dens in the traditional sense. You're not in a hiding hole, you're in a heat puzzle. Historians still debate whether the creature's primary drive was to escape external heat or to draw it out of itself. Two sides of the same coin, sure, but the distinction matters. One suggests fear, the other design. Maybe both. Maybe this tunnel was its only defense mechanism against the flaw written into its own tail. You reach a spot where the tunnel suddenly widens into an oval chamber. You hesitate before entering. It feels deliberate. You shine your light and spot the curved claw scrapes that form the perimeter. There's something odd here. The way the floor dips only in the middle, with the edges forming a slight rise like a lip. Was it for drainage, for holding moisture, for mud? You kneel in the shallow depression and lean back against the curve. The temperature drops again. You feel the relief the dinosaur must have felt slumped here after a dig. Maybe panting, maybe dreaming, maybe irritated that it still wasn't cool enough. Some researchers believe Thermovenator produced an oily secretion from glands at the base of its tail, coating the skin to retain hydration and create a cooling film when buried. It's a controversial theory, partly because glandular evidence doesn't fossilize well, and partly because the idea of a sweaty-tailed dinosaur just feels weird. But then again, so does this entire tunnel. You run your hand over the floor. The soil texture changes, patches of finer dust mixed with something more granular. Bits of stone, maybe, but some are aligned, arranged. You pause. What if this was an intentional layer? A cooling bed of mineral-rich gravel designed to hold and disperse body heat better than raw clay. Birds line nests with fur. Humans add ceramic tiles to kitchens. Why wouldn't a dinosaur choose cooler dirt? A strange thought occurs to you. These creatures didn't just survive their environment, they manipulated it. Like the ancient humans who learned to stack stone for shade before inventing roofs. Like desert foxes who build spiraling dens to catch crosswinds. These weren't brute creatures clawing at dirt in desperation. They were engineers with claws. And every tunnel shows evidence of revision. That's the thing. These weren't one-and-done digs. They were maintained, patched, expanded, sometimes even collapsed on purpose and rebuilt. Some tunnels from the fossil record show fill-in layering dirt pushed back into older sections, likely after they'd served their purpose. That suggests memory. or at the very least, behavior driven by learned experience. A tunnel that no longer cooled efficiently, block it off. Try again. Over time, the designs evolved not in bone, but in behavior. Modern beavers do this. They rebuild and redirect their dams, not for instinct, but for efficiency. Is it so hard to believe that Thermovenator with its 1,000-pound body and broiled tail adjusted its architecture the same way? Another strange fact, in the deeper chambers of these tunnels, archaeologists found clusters of smooth pebbles just a few inches in diameter. No clear reason for them to be there. They weren't nesting stones. Some argue they were temperature markers placed intentionally to sense soil heat. Others think they were tail toys, something to feel, while the creature lay buried, bored, and baking. A kind of prehistoric fidget spinner. You stretch out flat in the depression, staring at the low ceiling. Dust floats like sleep above your face. The longer you lie there, the more you understand. This wasn't shelter. This was strategy. This was elbow geometry. Clay-based defiance. An ancient blistered animal carving out equilibrium in a world designed to kill it. And suddenly, you get it. These creatures weren't fighting nature, they were negotiating. With every clawed inch of tunnel, they were whispering, "Give me this much cool and I won't die today." You smile. It's not a bad deal. You shuffle forward again, but this time with a different kind of reverence, like walking through the childhood home of someone long gone, every corner still shaped by their hands. The tunnel narrows once more, but something about it feels deliberate. A funneling effect. This next stretch is smoother, more regular, less panicked. You realize what it is. This part wasn't dug in distress, it was ritual. This is the part of the tunnel where they came to rest. And they did it a very particular way. You inch around a tight curve, and just ahead, you spot it. A widening, not in the chamber, but in the groove down the middle of the tunnel floor. A tail track, you're sure. Deep and continuous, like a dragging rope pressed into wet sand. And it ends in a sudden drop. A gentle bowl carved into the dirt. They slept like this. Tail first. It hits you all at once, the image. A massive creature backing slowly into the ground, hind legs half-folded, elbows bracing the tunnel walls, neck arched toward the opening, sniffing the wind. The tail, meanwhile, is slotted deep into the chamber behind it, pulsing gently as the cooler soil pulled heat from its veins. Like plugging your laptop into the wall at 3% battery, except if the battery overheated, you died. Modern crocodiles sleep with their bodies submerged and their nostrils above water, a compromise between breath and stealth. Here, it was breath and breeze. Thermovenator's nostrils, fossilized in a few lucky specimens, were flared slightly upward, as if designed to catch wind from a narrow opening, while the rest of the body vanished underground. That's why the front half of the tunnel rarely gets as wide or smooth as the back. The body didn't need to fully enter, just the tail. And once the creature was in place, all it had to do was wait. Maybe it dozed, maybe it hummed. Historians still debate whether these dinosaurs had vocal cords or at least structures capable of producing sound. Theories range from deep abdominal rumbles to tail frill vibrations. One eccentric paper even suggested that the tail might have worked like a wind chime, resonating when air moved past its ridges, producing low-pitched whistles to signal others. You shift and place your ear to the floor. Not because you expect to hear something, just because you want to. The soil is silent, but not empty. You close your eyes and imagine the breaths of a dozen of them, all across the plain, hidden in parallel tunnels, tails sunk in soil like roots, breathing, cooling, surviving. The idea that they slept this way, half in, half out, changes the whole story. It means the tunnel wasn't just about the tail. It was about the transition between worlds, between movement and stillness, between the searing light and the shadow of rest. That's a kind of poetry most modern animals don't need. Oddly enough, some modern burrowing mammals like the aardvark rest in similar positions. Tail deep in the den, body angled toward the entrance, ears twitching for danger. There's efficiency in that. Enough safety to relax, enough exposure to flee. You press your back to the wall again and trace one of the claw marks overhead. You can feel how many times it must have brushed the same spot, smooth, rhythmic. These creatures weren't panicking when they dug. Not always. This was habitual, practiced, like brushing teeth or making coffee with the lights off. Further down the chamber, you spot something stranger. A pair of opposing scrapes on the wall, symmetrical, evenly spaced. Unlike the chaotic shoulder gouges from earlier, these seem intentional, not for digging, for bracing, or maybe holding. You crouch low and mimic the position, forearms against the indentation's hips, low back arched. Your own body mimics the entry posture of the beast, a backward crawl, muscles locked in coordination, tail guiding the descent. It's not graceful. It's effective. And it worked for millions of years, until it didn't. The fossil record for Thermovenator ends suddenly, not with a slow decline but a gap. No transition fossils, no diminutive cousins, just a curtain drop. A few well-preserved burrow systems, and then silence. One theory suggests that a brief but brutal temperature spike tipped the scales. A few degrees higher, and even the deepest tail tunnels couldn't cope. Others blame invasive species burrow competition or a fungal infection that spread through the soil layers, infecting creatures as they slept. But there's a quieter possibility, one that sticks to the roof of your mind like cobwebs. What if they just got too good at what they did? Burrows became deeper, longer, more intricate. The need for surface dwindled. Interaction dropped. Reproduction required complex timing. If a species becomes too efficient at isolation, it risks collapsing from within. A heat dodger can't pass on its genes if it never meets another of its kind. That's the danger of building too much comfort underground. You scoot forward again. The air is so cool now it could pass for evening. Your fingers graze a fresh gouge in the floor, wider than the others. A final drag, a last-ditch dig. The tunnel here seems more erratic, as if the creature lost rhythm, lost time. Maybe it dug too long, maybe it couldn't stop. You think again about that sleeping posture. Tail first always, a surrender, but a smart one. A kind of trust in the earth to heal what the sky had burned. And in a world ruled by heat and hunger, that trust was probably the bravest thing it ever did. You're deeper now than you meant to go. Not just physically, though, that's true, but mentally. Somewhere back there where the tunnel started to narrow and the light got swallowed by the dirt, you stopped being a visitor and started becoming part of the story. The temperature has dropped another degree. You can feel it in your palms as they rest against the tunnel floor, cool, slightly damp, almost soothing. And then you see it, a tunnel within the tunnel. A subtle deviation in the wall curving off at a downward angle. It's narrower than the main passage, too tight for anything but the tail of a desperate or deeply determined creature. You follow it with your eyes, and there at the very end, just visible in the beam of your flashlight, is a darkened hollow perfectly tail-sized. This wasn't a mistake, it was an upgrade. Thermovenator evolved. That's what this tells you. That first tunnel, barely wide enough to fit its hips, was version 1. But as its tail grew heavier, longer, stranger, so did its strategy. This side channel is newer. You can tell by the color of the earth, less compacted, more recently disturbed, even in fossilized form. In this moment, you're not just looking at a tunnel. You're looking at progress. Historians still debate whether the expansion of tail size over generations was intentional in the evolutionary sense, sexual selection, heat dispersal, or even a kind of climate arms race. But the evidence is clear: the tunnels had to grow in length and depth to accommodate these grotesquely magnificent appendages. And every time they grew, the dinosaur changed its blueprints. Think about that. Not just growing longer tails, but building longer homes. A creature rewriting its habitat to match its body. You crawl into the side channel, carefully shoulder scraping both sides. The floor here is smoother than before, less gouged. More like a slipway than a tunnel. A cooling chute. You run your hand along the ground and feel parallel grooves, not claw marks, but tail drag. And deep ones. This dinosaur didn't just dig here. It used this space often. That means this wasn't a fluke. This was a routine. And it wasn't just about cooling you. Realize it was about placement. This entire species turned their tails into thermostats, and then evolved the behavior to place that thermostat precisely where it would lose the most heat, in the deepest part of the earth, furthest from the sun, directly against packed clay. You're reminded of a peculiar behavior in elephants. They flap their ears not just to cool down, but to direct blood flow toward the surface skin layers and enhance cooling. Except Thermovenator had no ears like that. It had a tail that served the same purpose, just in reverse. Instead of radiating heat outward, it buried the heat. The tail was no longer an accident. It was an engine, and engines need compartments. Odd fact, one fossilized specimen showed minute striations in the tailbone vertebrae, regular, almost pulsing like the notches on a violin string. Some paleobiologists think those were muscle anchors designed to rhythmically contract the tail for internal circulation, like a pump, a living radiator shoveling its own heat into dirt. That's why the tunnel kept growing, not just to fit the tail, but to house its new function. And you have to admire it. A species that adapted not by shrinking, not by simplifying, but by building. A creature that solved its greatest vulnerability by turning it into infrastructure. But evolution isn't tidy. The longer the tail grew, the deeper the burrow had to be. That meant more time digging, more energy lost, and when danger approached, the escape path grew longer too. A longer tunnel meant fewer exits, more risk. And if two Thermovenator burrows intersected, well, that became a whole new problem. Which brings us to the oldest form of underground politics territory. In deeper, more elaborate tunnel systems, paleontologists discovered something unusual. Marks made not by claws or tails, but by scraping motions along the walls at regular intervals, like signals. Communication carved into the environment. Some think these were warnings. Occupied, do not disturb, maybe even status markers like territorial graffiti. The positioning was too regular to be accidental, every 3 tail lengths a small gouge. Low on the wall, right where a backing-in tail would pass. It suggests a level of social behavior we weren't ready to admit. These weren't solitary beasts bumbling through mud. They were planners, signalers, maybe even negotiators. Imagine 2 of them meeting tail first in a shared tunnel, neither willing to expose its overheating spine to the sun. So instead of fighting, they scrape messages into the wall. 1 thump for occupied, 2 for move on, maybe they even waited their turn. You almost laugh at the idea of polite dinosaurs. But then again, modern ants communicate with pheromones so subtle we only just figured them out. Why not a creature whose entire lifestyle revolved around underground courtesy? And it wasn't just other dinosaurs they had to manage. Predators learned the pattern too. A Thermovenator at the mouth of its burrow was vulnerable, its tail cool, but its body exposed. Fossil evidence shows bite marks along the upper ribs of some specimens, often near tunnel openings. That meant every new tail length of growth increased danger at the other end. Longer tail, deeper tunnel, longer exposure. It was a balancing act, and nature rarely lets you keep both ends safe. You reach the bottom of the side channel and feel it, the coldest air yet. Still quiet, dense. The final tail resting place. The floor is so compacted it feels like stone. The groove here is perfect shape to match a finned tail down to the subtle ridge near its base. This was used, often. You sit in the groove and rest your back against the far wall. And for a moment, just a moment, you pretend you're one of them. That the weight behind you is a living, breathing tail radiating heat into the soil. that above you somewhere in the light, your snout flicks in the breeze. Not watching, just feeling. Cooling, waiting, surviving one more sun. You leave the side tunnel reluctantly, like stepping out of a cool bath into hot wind. The main tunnel feels warmer by comparison, not hot but less still. Less final. You keep low moving forward through a section that widens unexpectedly. The walls grow faintly scalloped, like the inside of a clam, and the floor begins to show tracks, double grooves sharp at the edges. This wasn't just a sleeping chamber. You blink. The grooves aren't from digging, they're impact marks. Long ones. Smooth and repeated. You squint and realize what you're seeing, tail drag scars. Not from carving soil, but from practice. Repetition, like the scuffed floor of a dojo. Here's a thought. What if the tunnel wasn't just for cooling? What if it was also for training? You sit down in the middle of the wide chamber cross-legged. The scarring in the floor arcs side to side. Some marks are thin, others are deeper, jagged. A flick, a whip, a slam. You think of monitor lizards, how they fight with tail strikes, snapping sideways like whips. Some fossil evidence suggests Thermovenator had similar musculature at the base of its tail, not for movement, for violence. And violence has its rhythms. During mating season, tail temperatures may have spiked not just from heat, but from blood flow hormones and competition. That's when fights happened, not with jaws or claws, but with tails. Precision instruments cooled, for maximum strength swung like maces in narrow duels. Some paleontologists argue these tail bouts occurred entirely underground. Two males meeting at a burrow intersection, unwilling to give ground-launching strikes in the only direction they had side to side. Confined tail combat, brutal blind, and echoing down the tunnels like thunder. You run a hand along the wall and notice something you missed before: parallel gouges on both sides. Not claw marks, tail impacts. And on the floor between them, powdered sediment. The debris of repetitive impact. This wasn't a random scrape. This was an arena. And it wasn't without risk. When two tails collided in a space this tight, something had to give. Fractures were likely. One specimen showed a healed crack across the finned tailbone, fused unevenly. It had survived the fight, but probably limped from then on. You crawl onward. The passage narrows again, then opens into a second wide chamber. Less scarring here, more structure. You pause. Something feels different. The floor has a slight bowl shape to it, subtle but unmistakable. It was meant to hold something, or someone. You remember one odd fact: certain specimens showed broad pelvic adaptations, almost like sitting bones. Not for walking, but for bracing. These weren't fast creatures, they were dig-in and hold-your-ground animals. And when provoked, they'd do just that: rear, slightly anchor and swing. Tail combat wasn't about killing. It was about dominance, territory, mating rights, and no one wanted to fight out in the open where the heat betrayed their tail's edge. So they fought in here. In shade. In tunnels where the dirt cooled your nerves and no predator dared follow. Historians still argue about whether these rituals ever turned deadly. Some think the fights were bluff, more sound than substance. Others point to disfigured fossils, mangled tail frills, and even rib damage that suggests things sometimes got serious. Heat breeds tension, and when your survival depends on where your tail rests, no one gives up the good spots easily. Oddly, none of this was discovered until recently. For decades, the tail was seen as little more than a decoration, an evolutionary mistake. It wasn't until the tunnels were excavated and matched with stress lines in the tailbones that a new theory emerged: the tail wasn't just a liability, it was a weapon. And now it all clicks. The tail drove everything. Where they lived, how they moved, who they fought, what they built, even how they slept. The tunnel was more than a shelter, it was a training hall, a spa, a fortress. A tail-first way of life. You pause and think about modern analogs. Kangaroos, for instance, use their tails to balance while boxing. Alligators use theirs to launch themselves out of water. The blue tangfish has venomous tail spines. Evolution loves a tail with a second job. So why not this? You lean back and let your head rest against the dirt wall. The air is quiet here, insulated. The kind of silence that swallows sound before it can echo. It's easy to imagine two massive creatures, squaring off tails, swaying eyes narrow, all body language. Then whap. The impact muted by Earth but devastating up close. And if one landed a good strike, the loser backed out the tunnel tail, dragging like a flag at half-mast. There's a beauty to it. A brutal earthbound ballet. The kind of thing no one would believe unless they'd seen the grooves themselves. Which you have. You take one last glance around the chamber and whisper something to the dark. Not a prayer exactly, but a nod. A quiet thanks for the glimpse. Then you move on, crawling once more into the next stretch of the tunnel. You're not sure how much deeper it goes, but if it follows the logic of the tale, it doesn't end yet. Because the longer the tale, the deeper the truth. The next bend in the tunnel smells different, like ash or maybe scorched minerals. It's faint but unsettling, like the memory of a fire that hasn't fully gone out. You press forward slowly, your shoulders brushing gritty ridges on either side. The soil changes too. It's darker here, with specks of glassy sheen baked into the clay. You tap your flashlight against one patch and hear a dull click. This wasn't just soil. This was burned. You reach a pocket where the roof curves low and begins to collapse inward, creating a jagged shelf of broken earth, a failed chamber. It must have caved in long ago, maybe, while the creature was digging it, maybe long after. You move cautiously, testing each inch before you shift your weight. The whole tunnel feels more fragile now. The structure is wounded, and you realize this wasn't all survival. Sometimes the ground fought back. For all their strategy, Thermovenator faced constant environmental sabotage. Volcanic eruptions, sediment shifts. Underground gas pockets. They didn't live in a peaceful layer cake of dirt. They dug through chaos, and that chaos pushed back. Historians still debate how many of the burrow collapses were natural and how many were the result of conflict. Was this caved-in section caused by heat-thinned soil or the desperate flailing of a losing tail duel? We don't know, but the broken claw marks leading away from the collapsed pocket suggest someone made it out. Just barely. You slip through the narrowest section, yet holding your breath, then fall into a new chamber, deeper, colder, but littered with debris, shattered tunnel walls, cracked sediment slabs, a kind of prehistoric construction zone. And among the rubble, something else. Wood. At first you think it's a root, but it isn't tangled like a root, and it's far too smooth. You run your fingers along its length. It's straight, purposeful, charred, hardened by heat. A branch maybe, but sharpened at one end. It doesn't make sense. Dinosaurs didn't use tools, right? Except some burrows show repeated patterns, identical scrape depths, right angles carved into clay. Maybe it wasn't intelligence. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe these creatures found sticks and used them as bracing tools, or even levered out stones to dig faster. Modern crows use sticks. So do sea otters and chimps. The leap isn't as large as it sounds. Odd fact: wombats. Yes, wombats use their rumps to block predators in tunnel systems and have been seen rearranging rocks to reinforce den entrances. If marsupials can manage basic tunnel engineering, why not a dinosaur with a deadly overheating tail and a long summer to kill? Whatever the truth, it is clear these tunnels evolved because the world outside became too much. But that world sometimes reached in anyway. Floods were common. Seasonal deluges turned comfortable burrows into mud traps. In some fossil beds, you find perfectly preserved tails ending in panicked claw scrapes, marks that say it came too fast. You can almost hear the sound of mud sloshing walls groaning, the slurp of clay folding in on itself. And yet, they didn't stop digging. You pass through another tight gap where the floor buckles upward. Earthquake damage, maybe, or tectonic shift. This tunnel was reused even after damage. The layers say so older gouges beneath newer ones just slightly off-center. That tells you something important these creatures remembered. They returned. Even when things went wrong, they came back to rebuild. Or maybe just to try again. You imagine a young thermovenator still awkward in its tunnel crawling, following the scent trail of an elder through a half-collapsed shaft, slipping, learning, failing, then finding a new chamber to carve, not with speed, with stubbornness. You rest against a wall where a faint white coating glistens in your light. Salt, left behind by rising groundwater or evaporated body fluids, sweat maybe. The air down here isn't just cool, it's seasoned with effort. You notice one more thing: patches of darker soil along the upper chamber wall smeared in broad strokes. These aren't scrape marks, they're coating. Applied from the body maybe. Mucus secretion. Something to stabilize the walls. Some researchers believe thermovenator produced a skin oil secreted under stress or extreme heat, and rubbed it into the tunnel walls not just to cool itself, but to bind the soil. A kind of biological plaster. It's still debated. But in this chamber, the walls are firmer where the smears are thickest. Maybe this was their version of patching drywall. You sit down and let the weight of it all sink in. These weren't just creatures with tails. These were builders. Fighters. Survivors with bad odds and worse terrain who never once stopped trying to cool themselves down. And even when the world sent quakes, floods, heat waves, predators, or rot into their underground world, they stayed. They adjusted, and they adapted the way all great survivors do by getting weird. This tunnel, broken as it is, still holds. It's not elegant, it's not safe, but it's there. You're here. And ahead another chamber. Maybe another trick. A new way to resist the heat. Because one thing is clear now. Every collapse taught them something. You crawl forward, passing through the aftermath of the broken tunnel like a spelunker, tracing someone else's unfinished thought. The next chamber feels different, calmer. The air is cooler again, yes, but more than that, there's a strange silence to the dirt. Like the soil is listening. And then you feel it. A faint vibration. You freeze. It's not mechanical, not thunder. It's rhythmic, subtle. A pulse in the walls. You lean in and feel the groove of the tunnel floor again, pressing your palm flat. The vibration repeats. Not strong enough to be seismic. Not chaotic enough to be collapse. It's directional, measured, like a message. You remember what the researchers called it, tail-to-tail diplomacy? Because not all encounters down here were violent. Some were conversations. You crawl deeper and enter a wider stretch of tunnel. No gouges, no scrapes, just long, shallow tail marks crisscrossing like brushstrokes on canvas. They don't strike the walls. They echo along them. Imagine it, two thermovenator individuals occupying adjacent tunnels. No sightlines, no voices, just tail-to-tail communication. A thump against the earth, a low spiral drag, a side scrape in a looped pattern, signals. Researchers still argue over what the signals meant. Was it territory-marking courtship, threat display, or some combination of all three? Here's a theory that caught your attention. The frilled tail fins with their thin ridges and nerve-dense tips acted as vibration sensors and emitters. Like prehistoric tuning forks, a tail pressed into packed soil could pick up distant motion, other dinosaurs, predators, weather. And when the tail moved deliberately, it could send pulses down the line. You lean back and imagine that world. Heat above, silence below, and every tail in its tunnel twitching, waiting, translating. Thump. Occupied. Drag spiral. Mate nearby. Sharp slap. Back off. It wasn't language. It was dirt code. Earth-transmitted messaging. And the placement of the tail, always buried deep in its cooling groove, made it the perfect transmitter. It's beautiful in its own way. Modern elephants communicate across kilometers with infrasound vibrations so low they pass through the ground. Maybe thermovenator wasn't speaking, it was drumming. You place your hand against the wall again, hoping absurdly that something might thump back. It doesn't. But the wall is scored with looped, smoothed ridges where a tail spun carefully in circles. You wonder if it was nervousness, or excitement, or just music. Odd fact, in some tunnel systems, tail marks are found layered 2 or more overlapping sets moving in different directions. It suggests that burrows weren't always exclusive. Sometimes they were shared, temporarily. 2 creatures trading messages without ever facing each other. And here comes the unsettling part. There are fossils where 2 adult-sized thermovenator are preserved in parallel tunnel systems, mere inches apart. Their tails loop toward one another, almost touching through the soil. Paleontologists call it the mirrored tail burial. Some believe it was a mated pair who died together during a collapse. Others argue they were rivals fighting to the bitter end. Historians still debate whether they died in peace or in war, but the image is unforgettable. 2 massive tails shaped by heat and hardship pressed into the dirt like old hands reaching through stone. You smile at the thought of prehistoric diplomacy, not with banners or trumpets, but with rhythms in the soil. Of course, not all signals were honored. In one fossil site, a larger individual's tail marks overwrote the loops of a smaller one. The deeper gouges pushed through the pattern. A message erased. A territory claimed. You imagine the quiet betrayal of it. A thump returned with silence. A loop met with a slash. Here in the tunnel, you now crawl through the markings are gentle, paired, mutual. You begin to suspect this chamber was a courtship hall. The tail behavior in the mating season must have been elaborate. Cooling before mating was likely essential. Too much heat would have damaged reproductive tissue, so they cooled together tail to tail long before anything else. Imagine that scene, 2 massive beasts reversing into parallel trenches, tails brushing through soil, communicating without words, only with pressure and temperature and movement. Romance at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with no room to turn around. And then, after all that delicate negotiation movement, a ripple. The loop shifts direction, permission, maybe even desire. You chuckle quietly in the tunnel, the sound swallowed instantly by the walls. Modern crabs do complex dances with claws and sand flicks. Why not a dinosaur in the dirt seducing a mate with tail spirals? Another theory, more speculative, suggests the tail frill may have secreted pheromones dispersed through tunnel air by movement. You picture 2 frilled tails vibrating in harmony, the air thick with prehistoric cologne. So here in this cooler chamber among soft swirls and mirrored ridges, you pause again. You've seen the training grounds, the battle scars, the architecture of desperation, but here finally is something gentler. Not survival, not dominance. Connection. And as you lay your hand gently into the same groove where a tail once rested, you don't feel the echo of violence. You feel patience and rhythm, the sound of 2 strangers in the dark, learning to speak through dirt. The tunnel shifts again, not in direction but in tone. There's a strange pattern now to the air itself. As you breathe, it feels thinner, lighter, as though it's being tugged upward. You pause, nose twitching, then realize what's happening. Air is moving. Upward. You lift your head and scan the ceiling, and there it is, an opening. A narrow, vertical shaft just wide enough for your shoulders. You shine your flashlight upward and catch the curve of a side tunnel branching off like a hidden passage in an ant mound. You found a reverse chimney. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate. Thermovenator didn't just dig to cool its tail. It started shaping air itself. The first time scientists documented this phenomenon, it was mistaken for a collapsed hole. But the structure was too clean, too uniform, like a stovepipe but with airflow that moved naturally from bottom to top. Cool air drawn into the tunnel from one end, heated by the dinosaur's body, then funneled upward through this vent. Primitive convection, underground draft engineering. It was brilliant. Some historians still debate whether these chimneys were dug intentionally or simply emerged from the pattern of reused burrows. But it doesn't matter. The outcome was the same tunnels that breathed, that vented, that protected the tail and the lungs. You test the shaft with your hand. A faint current flows upward, a breath the tunnel has been exhaling for millions of years. Modern prairie dogs build similar structures. A low entrance, a high exit. Temperature and pressure differences do the rest. Even termites sculpt mounds with internal airflow that rivals human HVAC systems. But this was millions of years earlier, and it came from a dinosaur with no tools, no blueprints, no city plan, just a need to stay cool long enough not to die. You crawl forward and discover the tunnel splits here, one chamber veering left, shallow and sloped. The other straight ahead seems almost ceremonial, wider than necessary, with a strange turn in its center. And at the center of that turn, a false entrance. A wall built with compacted dirt, just tall enough to block view from outside, just solid enough to fool anything chasing from behind. A trick, a security feature. The first time this was found in fossil record, no one believed it. Dinosaurs don't build false walls, they said. It's too intentional, too human. But layer analysis showed the soil came from deeper within the burrow, moved, pressed, and reinforced. Not natural, constructed. Which means Thermovenator not only modified airflow, it manipulated visibility. Used camouflage, controlled line of sight. Odd fact, meerkats sometimes dig dead-end tunnels that curve back toward the main chamber. When threatened, they bolt into the fake tunnel and hide motionless while predators watch the wrong exit. Maybe this dinosaur had a similar strategy. Maybe its burrow was never one straight road, it was a trap maze. A tail-cooled labyrinth of misdirection. And here's where it gets stranger. One excavation in Argentina found a tunnel system with 7 connected burrows. Not random. A central axis with branches, some with tail chambers, others with nesting zones, a few with nothing at all but open space and airflow. It wasn't a home. It was a system. A prehistoric fortress disguised as a hole in the dirt. You think back to earlier sections, the tunnels, with bracing gouges, the reinforced smears, the tail grooves that moved with choreography. All of it points to one thing: this dinosaur wasn't just reacting to heat. It was redesigning its world. Nature gives us claws, tails, and teeth. But when those aren't enough, the survivors become architects, clay engineers, bone-backed masons. And that's what Thermovenator was. It didn't just burrow, it built. You crawl through another turn, this one looping around a block of harder soil. An air pocket or a natural heat deflector. The result is the same temperature dips as you pass it. The design here is intentional. Layers upon layers of knowledge etched into earth by claws, elbows, and heat-ravaged tails. And then, finally, you reach a chamber that feels calm. It's quiet. Wide, tidy. The air moves freely. The floor is packed flat and there's no sign of combat or collapse. Just a long, shallow groove at the center, tail-sized, of course, and wall striations shaped like slow tail spirals. Not frantic, not defensive. Comfortable. Historians call these stabilization chambers. The last stop before full rest. The place where the tail came to finish cooling and the body remained alert. Not asleep, not hiding, just existing. You lower yourself into the groove fitting perfectly between the ridges. For the first time since entering this tunnel, your body relaxes without effort. You get why they kept coming back here. This wasn't escape. This was sanctuary. You lie still and think about the last dinosaur who used this chamber. Maybe it came here every year for a decade. Maybe it cleared the air vent with its nose, scraped the false wall a little higher, smoothed the dirt, improved the draft. And then one day, maybe it didn't come back. But the tunnel stayed. A hollow record of decisions etched in patience, sealed by heat and preserved by luck. This chamber doesn't feel like the end, but it feels like a pause, like an exhale before the next long crawl. You roll to your side, brush a layer of dust from the floor, and watch it swirl upward, caught in a current too subtle to name. The tunnel is breathing again. You crawl forward slowly, letting your hands guide you. The tunnel tightens again, narrowing like a thought pulling into focus. But something shifts in the soil under your palms, less compact, more arranged. Not just dug, shaped. And then you see it, a soft rise in the floor, almost too even. A dome beneath the dirt. You clear a layer of dust and expose a gentle depression in the middle of a raised platform, flattened, precise. Around the edge, ridges like spokes from a central point. You blink. This isn't a tail groove, it's a nest. But not in the open. Not under ferns or tucked against roots. No, this one is hidden deep within the tunnel. Sheltered from sun, storm, and sound. It contradicts everything we thought. For decades, the prevailing theory was that Thermovenator laid its eggs above ground like most dinosaurs under canopy shade or in communal pits. But this fossilized tunnel system discovered in a collapsed chamber changed everything. At the center, a hardened ring of crushed shell fragments, and within it the fossil of a juvenile tail. Still finned, still perfect. One hatchling, inside the tunnel. Historians still debate the implications. Was this a fluke? A storm-forced decision? Or had they, over generations, turned these tail-cooling networks into underground nurseries? You stare at the nest. It's unmistakable now. Built not for numbers, but for protection. There's only space here for 1 or 2 eggs. This wasn't mass production. It was a precision investment. And suddenly the tunnel changes again. What you thought was all about survival, the tail, the cooling, the airflow starts to seem like inheritance. Not just a place to wait out heat, but a space to raise something delicate through it. You reach the next chamber and find more signs, shallow wall grooves not deep enough for tail strikes, but regular repeating, as if something had been pacing or swaying, maybe the parent staying nearby. Watching the nest. There's no fossil of an adult here, but the clues suggest it didn't leave. You think about that, an animal that stayed. Modern reptiles like crocodiles guard their nests with shocking loyalty. They don't just lay and leave, they protect, monitor, teach. There are reports of crocodile mothers lifting their babies gently in their mouths to carry them to water. Why wouldn't Thermovenator, already a master of environmental control, apply that instinct to its youngs? It fits. A species obsessed with temperature would know the danger of heat on hatchlings. A tail too warm could kill an adult, but it could cook an egg. What safer place than a tunnel tuned for thermal regulation? There's even a theory, odd beautiful, that the parent would lay sideways, tail extending into its cooling groove belly, pressed to the tunnel wall, using its own body to modulate chamber temperature. A living incubator. Heat pulled from the tail passed into the dirt, kept away from the fragile core. The more you think about it, the more the tunnel becomes more than a shelter. It becomes a womb. The strange marks on the ceiling, for example, shallow scrapes too high for digging claws. Maybe the creature wasn't digging. Maybe it was reinforcing the chamber to keep it from collapsing on its offspring. Patting the ceiling like a parent tucks a sheet around a sleeping child. You imagine the hatchling's first breath in darkness and cool silence, surrounded by walls shaped by tail and time. Its first movements would be in dirt. Its first heartbeat matched to the quiet pulse of airflow through the chimney vents. This was home before it ever saw the sky. And maybe that's why the tunnels lasted. Maybe that's why they grew. Not out of desperation, but out of love, the slow, dirty, unglamorous kind. The kind that doesn't roar or fly. The kind that digs and waits. And it explains something else. In later tunnel systems, those dated just before the species vanished, architects found designs more complex than ever. Multi-chamber layouts, ventilation built into nesting pockets with angled shafts to direct warm air away. That's not instinct. That's refinement. It's the behavior of the species learning that the best way to preserve its future is to chill it just right. And it worked for a while. But then came the change. Whether it was climate predators, infection, or all of it together, something pushed them back toward the surface. Tunnel systems stopped getting deeper. They shortened. The final burrows on record shallow, frantic, incomplete. The babies never had a chance. You reach the edge of the nesting chamber and stop reluctant to leave. The air here feels different, charged, like the memory of warmth without the heat. You brush your fingers along the nesting groove one last time and whisper something quiet into the dirt. You don't know why, but it feels right. You crawl on, and now the tunnel narrows again, not harshly, but with purpose. Ahead, it starts to bend, not erratically like a collapse, but smoothly, toward something. You keep moving, but your mind stays behind. Stays with the parent who laid the egg. Stayed with it. Waited. Watched. And maybe never left. The tunnel breathes you forward again, and this time the walls feel closer, more deliberate. You sense precision in the curvature. This wasn't burrowed in a frenzy. It was shaped with care, like the path of something that knew where it needed to be. The deeper you crawl, the more the walls lose their random scarring. The claw marks become rare. The groove on the floor grows smoother, darker, familiar. And then it stops. Just stops. A sheer wall of earth unbroken. No turn, no chamber, no draft, just an ending. But not like before. You've seen collapsed tunnels where the ceiling folds, the walls sag, and the floor buckles under its own memory. This isn't that. The soil here is compacted, packed by something large, heavy, something that pressed itself into the space and made no plans to leave. You study the final groove in the floor wider than the others. Deeper too. A tail was here. You know it instinctively. This wasn't a passing visit, it was the last stop. A fossilized record of unfinished intention. Historians still debate whether the so-called final burrow was a heat refuge gone wrong or something more poignant. Some say the dinosaur miscalculated, dug too late into an accelerating heat wave and perished mid-construction. Others believe it was an old individual too weak to escape the rising temperature, and so it carved one last retreat and lay down in the only place it ever truly trusted. You reach for the wall ahead, flat, firm, undisturbed, and tap it with your knuckles. Dust rises soft and gray, the same dust that once cooled blood just beneath scaly skin. You picture it again. The thermovenator tail dragging behind movement slow and uneven. The sun above blistering the ground. Every step deliberate. Not to hunt, not to feed, just to dig. You can see it claws carving slowly, no longer with efficiency, but with memory. The rhythm of its ancestors echoing in its bones. Not digging to escape, but to finish, to return. Not where it was born, but to the idea of safety shaped in soil. There's a mark near the end of the groove. Not a scrape, more of a ridge. A last heave of earth still clinging to shape. As if the tail twitched once more. Maybe a last reflex, or maybe a final adjustment. The kind we all make before sleep. Odd fact, some desert tortoises, when dying of heat exhaustion, instinctively burrow, even if it won't save them. The motion is not about survival anymore. It's about ritual, about finishing something. You sit back in the narrow space and let the quiet close in. It's not mournful, just resolved. As if this chamber, unlike the others, wasn't meant to be reused. No fresh claw marks, no overlapping loops. Just this groove, this shape, this story told one last time by a body that remembered how to shape the earth even as it left it. There's a subtle elevation to the final wall, almost like it was pushed inward, as if the dinosaur used its body to seal itself in. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to keep the heat out, or keep something else in. Some theorize this was instinctual mummification, that certain individuals sensing death would close their tunnels to preserve body moisture, slow decomposition, and cool their remains. It sounds fanciful, but the preservation quality in these final burrows is better than open-surface fossils. Their tails stay intact longer. Their vertebrae preserve vascular etchings, even faint impressions of skin. And that raises the question, did they know? Did this thermovenator tail, bruised from years of survival lungs, scarred from heat claws, dulled by age, decide to end things here? Or was it just another hot day that went on too long? You crouch lower, placing a hand along the base of the wall. The air here is the coldest you've felt. Not icy, but resolute. Final. If you had to choose a place to stop, this would be it. And maybe that's the real legacy of these creatures, not just the tunnels they built, but the fact that they always came back to them. No matter how hard the sun pressed, no matter how many floods or predators or collapses, they returned, tail first always, trusting the earth to hold them, cool them, outlast them. One fossil site recorded a tunnel just like this, sealed, with the bones of a single adult at the end. No signs of struggle, just alignment. Head tilted slightly, tail in groove, spine curved to the shape of the burrow. It's called the last retreat. You stare at this wall and wonder if you found another one. There's no way to be sure, but your gut says yes. This tunnel didn't end in failure. It ended with intention, with choice. You whisper to the dirt one last time and turn around carefully. The passage is narrow and backing out feels strange now, like breaking a spell. But you do it anyway, not quickly, with reverence. The kind reserved for ancient things that were never meant to be seen again. You crawl in reverse, one arm at a time, retracing your way through the quiet you hadn't noticed until now. The tunnel doesn't feel like a passage anymore. It feels like a lung, one that has finally exhaled. As you twist through a bend, the air shifts again, warmer now. Slightly, but there's something new too. A smell. Earthy, yes, but not just dirt. Something faintly organic, like moss or rot, but sweeter. You pause at a cross-section, a place you passed before without noticing. But now, the light catches it differently. A thin greenish film hugs the lower wall. It glows faintly where your flashlight skims across it. Lichen, specifically a species that shouldn't be here. You reach out, press your fingers lightly to the patch. It's soft, dry, and somehow alive. Despite the cold, despite the dark, despite the fact that nothing's been down here for millions of years except you. Lichen doesn't grow like that on accident. What you found is known in certain fossil studies as resilient lichen trace strata. A mouthful, sure, but what it means is this. In a few very rare burrows, living organisms persisted long after the diggers vanished. Lichen, fungi, microbial mats that adapted to a world shaped by tail heat and tunnel drafts. In other words, the tunnel never truly died. It was inherited. That's the part people forget. Life doesn't just replace life, it builds on it. Sometimes it curls itself around old bones and waits. Sometimes it settles in cooled grooves, drinking moisture from ancient clay. And sometimes, like here, it spreads quietly across walls left behind by a species that didn't know how much it changed the dirt. Odd fact, there's a fungus in Siberia that has remained alive in permafrost for over 400,000 years. It doesn't bloom. It doesn't move. It just waits. Its DNA is more patient than ours. You lean forward and examine more of the wall. The lichen isn't random. It follows the same old grooves. The spiral marks from tail signals. The scraped edges of former sleeping spots. It's like the lichen prefers those places, feeds off the same currents the tail once cooled. Historians still debate whether this is coincidence or coevolution. Did these microbes thrive simply because the conditions were stable? Or did they form some sort of symbiosis with the burrow? Maybe the tail heat itself created conditions ideal for spores, fertilized the wall, so to speak. You chuckle. The idea of a dinosaur accidentally becoming a gardener for future fungi is peak evolutionary comedy. But it's also beautiful. Because it means the tunnel remembered. You slide deeper into the lichen-ringed curve and notice that it's thickest in corners where airflow would have stagnated. That tells you the microbes didn't just survive. They read the tunnel. They used it, inhaled its blueprints, and maybe reshaped it. Some chambers discovered in Argentina show fungal growth patterns strong enough to alter the integrity of the tunnel walls. The microbes bound loose sediment, hardened certain passageways, and in one case created a spongy floor texture that resisted collapse. Which raises a question. Did these organisms merely persist after the dinosaur? Or did they help preserve the tunnels in the first place? A tail cooled the clay cooled the tail. And long after the tail was gone, the clay remembered the rhythm and passed it on. The idea of legacy feels different underground. Above the surface, bones get picked apart, weathered, named, but down here no fossils, just shapes, scars, grooves in dirt that hold the echoes of breath, muscle, and motion. And lichen. You reach the end of this stretch and find the densest growth, yet a soft green pillow clinging to an air vent's interior. The breeze from earlier still flows faint but steady. The lichen dances ever so slightly, responding to the breath of the tunnel, not reacting to you, reacting to it, to the tunnel itself. This vent might not lead anywhere now. It's sealed above, but something about it still cycles air. Maybe temperature shifts cause the push and pull. Maybe the earth still moves. Or maybe this place remembers how to breathe on its own. The same way trees remember which direction is up. You place your hand flat against the fungal wall, and for a second you swear it feels warm. But it's not. It's just alive. You whisper again, not even sure what you're saying. Something like gratitude. Something like awe. Then you start to crawl again. Slower now. Because from this point on, everything you pass has been reshaped not by claws or tails, but by what came after. The microbial inheritance. The quiet colonists. The ones who didn't dig but endured. And you realize that while Thermovinator built this world with desperate ingenuity, something else claimed it in peace. And never left. The tunnel tilts upward now, not sharply, but enough that your knees feel the slope. It's a gentle return to light if the light still exists at all. Your body aches, but it moves with a strange rhythm now, one that mimics the thing that came before you. You're not crawling. You're gliding. Tail first in spirit, if not in spine. You pause beneath a low ceiling where the tunnel narrows just slightly. Something catches your eye. There's a mark here, shallow, subtle, nearly erased by time, but not random. A crosshatch, repeating. You run your fingers over it. It's too regular to be erosion. It was carved. Not by claws, not by tail, by pressure. You've reached one of the oldest chambers, a place etched with the body, not just the tools of the dinosaur. Rib impressions along the wall, hip pressure against the side slope, even the faint groove of a jaw where it must have rested its head. Not dead, just deeply asleep. This is where you remember Thermovinator didn't live in the tunnel. It became the tunnel. Every limb helped dig it, shape it, cool it. And in its stillness, the body recorded itself in walls softer than time. You press your palm into one of the rib curves and it fits uncomfortably eerily into the shape. And in that second, you feel it again. The rhythm, the reason, the why of the tunnel. It was never a home. It was a memory palace. Not the kind filled with symbols or objects or stories, but with muscle, with routine, with repetition so deep it carved itself into sediment. This was where the dinosaur remembered what it was made to do, survive the heat. And it did so, not with strength, but with habit. Historians still debate whether the patterns of the tunnel, the loops, the branches, the air shafts, the false walls were learned or instinctive. But that debate misses the point. Because instinct is memory, old memory, written in DNA, passed like a whispered riddle from one tale to the next. You press on. This part of the tunnel is richer in detail than all the others, not because it's better preserved, but because it was used more. Every inch here was touched, leaned against, braced with shoulder or tail. It's smoother in places, burnished. It was loved. Strange to say that about a pile of dirt, but it's true. You can feel it. This tunnel wasn't a tool. It was a legacy. Odd fact. There's a species of fish in the Amazon that carves mating hollows into the riverbed. Perfect concentric circles. Geometrically exquisite. Not because it knows what geometry is, but because its body remembers the movement. That's what this tunnel is, not a plan, a dance. You reach a corner where the groove turns sharply. There's no practical reason for it. Straight would have been easier, but the curve was carved intentionally. It leads into a low alcove like a sidestep off the main flow. And inside that alcove, no bones, no fossils, just a kind of peace. You sit there for a moment cross-legged and you can almost hear the silence not as absence but as repetition. This was where one creature paused, probably more than once, to rest. Or to think if thinking even happened, or maybe just to be unwatched, unexposed, utterly safe. You take a breath and realize you're not underground anymore. Not really. You're inside a body long gone crawling through what it left behind. Not just the physical space, but the lived shape. The curves and hollows where it was most itself. That changes you. Up ahead, the tunnel brightens. Not much, but enough to notice you're reaching the end. The other side. You keep your pace slow, not because you're tired, but because you're not ready. And the tunnel feels that too. The groove on the floor fades, becoming shallower, less defined. The claw marks vanish. The walls lose their polish, their language. Everything unwinds. You're leaving the core. You pause one last time and turn around, not physically, but in your mind. You picture the length of tunnel behind you. Tail grooves and cooling alcoves. False walls and spiral signals. Chimneys that breathed long after the last breath. And at the end, a sealed chamber where a dinosaur chose to stop. You were never walking through a tunnel. You were walking through an idea. The slope becomes gentle now, and you begin the slow incline toward the surface. Though surface feels like a myth at this point, like something that exists only in other people's stories. Your hands know the tunnel better than your eyes do. They touch the familiar grooves and dips like braille, like prayer. It's warmer here, not by much. Just enough for your body to notice the shift. The groove in the center of the floor, so dominant through the tunnel's core, is gone. The tail would never reach this far. This part was for other things. For listening maybe, for watching, for facing the outside without stepping fully into it. You stop in a wide, low room near the exit, where wind whispers faintly through a collapsed chimney. The light here is soft and broken, filtered by dust and time. You don't speak, you just sit. Because this is where it ends. Not the tunnel, the rhythm. This space was never meant to be permanent. You can tell. The dirt is looser, the walls thinner. It was designed to change, to collapse, to seal. One fossil site records a final chamber like this with slumped walls and a tail still partially inside. Scientists believe the dinosaur died facing outward, not by heat, not by injury, just in waiting. As if it had hoped for something different to come walking past. A breeze, a mate, a shadow. Historians still debate whether this final act was intentional. If the tunnel's architect dug until it felt the air grow warm again and simply lay there one last protest against the sun. Others say the creature may have been too weak to retreat, that it fell asleep here just inches from escape. But this space you think wasn't for escape, it was for letting go. You run your fingers along the upper curve of the wall. The soil is soft here, untouched by lichen. Just bare memory, a surface that held the shoulders of giants. You turn your head to the opening now, where wind trembles through broken reeds and dusk-colored dust. You can't quite see the outside, but it's there. The sky still burning, still waiting, and the same sun they built these tunnels to defy, and somehow, even knowing what it cost them, you don't hate it. Because they did survive. For longer than they should have. On a planet that kept changing its mind. Through drought and flood, predator and fire. They persisted, with nothing but dirt and design. And those tails, oh, those ridiculous, over-engineered tails. You smile now despite the grit on your teeth. A tail too hot to function. a body forced underground, a species that didn't die off screaming but sculpting. Maybe that's what all legacies are. The part of you that needs protecting turned into architecture. The thing you drag behind you transformed into something sacred. And when the final tale cooled for the last time, the tunnel stayed. It outlived the claws, outlived the blood, outlived the body that birthed it. And here you are, still crawling through its shadow, at the mouth of the tunnel. Now you rise slowly, like something emerging from hibernation. The air is dry, hot, buzzing faintly with insects. Somewhere, wind crosses an ancient plain the same way it always has. You don't look back. You close your eyes instead and listen, not for footsteps, not for voices, but for the memory of Earth, remembering what it once held.